Hi! In a digital world where everything is trying to consume all your time and attention, I want to welcome you to a space where reading is rebellious. So, welcome to my YouTube channel, Novel Cowgirl, where the literary outlaw and us all can find sanctuary in reading and reclaim our time and attention and our mental health. And so, this video, if you're watching, must be because you like the 60s or are interested in the book about the 60s. And that's why I'm in a different spot because I'm going to be reaching behind me to show you the different books I've collected over 10 years. Um, I want to take it back to be like, why specifically the 60s, not really the 70s, not really the 50s. I cannot tell you why. As a little girl, I even dressed up as a hippie a couple of times for Halloween. I've just always been very interested in the time period, the culture, the music, the art, um, the political nature of that decade, the kind of dichotomy of being the summer of love while also Vietnam War is happening. So it's just a time period with a lot of complexity and nuance. And that said, this video is going to be primarily about the musicians, the celebrities, the culture of the 60s. That's not to say that the politics and the movements in Vietnam War were not important to look at and research and study because they are essential to this multi-layered conversation that exists around the 60s. I hope someday in the future I'll feel more confident and educated to talk about kind of the 60s as a whole. I'll be honest, I have not read every single book. Some of these are new and some of these I just started reading and might have put down and didn't pick back up. I do, though, want to say, though, that the 60s is a complicated time. A lot of good things came from the 60s and a lot of bad things came from the 60s. And I think if people can look back and be like, well, that was another time and things were different. But here now, as I create this video, we are more aware of things that probably weren't so great happening at the time and think than they happened anyways. And so I just want to preface that although I might get excited about some of these people or these books, I can look back and recognize that maybe a 10-year-old, not 10-year-old me, an 18-year-old me saw the impact of the 60s very differently than I do now. And there is a lot of nuance and there is a lot of complications with this conversation, and I'm aware of that, and I do like want to keep it an open-ended and healthy, I think healthy dialogue that everybody can contribute to. But I do want to say, though, I'm not trying to glamorize these people. A lot of these people, although they might be great, they might have done some bad things or said some bad things, and we can still acknowledge that these are complex people with a lot of nuance and a lot of different personalities. I still feel like it's pertinent to include um, these narratives on the shelf, because it is a part of a multifaceted look at the 60s. And so, with that being said, I'm going to start off with kind of like the big thing that I think everybody knows about the 60s, and that's Woodstock. And so I have The Road to Woodstock. I just recently got it, The Road to Woodstock, from the man behind the legendary festival, Michael Lang. This is the same Michael Lang that was in the documentary about the Woodstock 90s that was not great. But this is about the origin, how it came to be, how monumental this event was. It talks about some of the the rock stars that were there. We have festivals all the time now with all types of artists, but I think it is kind of hard to uh, put into sense the how big these acts were, how big these rock stars were performing at Woodstock with like minimal to none security. It's kind of wild to think about how this was executed and pulled off. So I'm really excited to read this and add to my further knowledge about Woodstock specifically. So I feel like it is only in the best interest of the fuller conversation of the 60s when people talk about Woodstock that we also bring up the 1969 Harlem Culture Festival. And Questlove made a documentary a few years ago called Summer of Soul, in kind of compliments of the Summer of Love. And this event was just as impactful, revolutionary, um, a kind of event, a lot like Woodstock, but this was not highlighted as much. And we were looking at musicians like Nina Simone and B.B. King, and Stevie Wonder. We were seeing the social activists of the time, different celebrities of the Black community talking at the Harlem Culture Festival. I am including a link down below that is I could not do this any justice because who wrote this list of books was incredible to bring it all together. And so I'm just going to list it down below. Check it out. It's a comprehensive companion list of the Summer of Soul that you can like read along with the documentary, which I thought was really cool. So go ahead, check that out. Next is Astral Weeks by Ryan Walsh. And Astral Weeks being named, this book being named after the Van Morrison album. And so this is called Astral Weeks, The Secret History of 1968. And so I've read quite a few like 60s books about specific instances and kind of like, for example, the Sharon Tate murders. And this, I think, like that has a lot of coverage and a lot of literature around it, and you can find a lot of media. But this I hadn't heard much about, and so it's interesting to read about the secret history of 1968, where Ryan Walsh essentially is tagging onto all these different people of the time, random people, but they end up being big key players in a lot of things. And so, yeah, it's kind of influenced by Van Morrison, but it's not just about Van Morrison. It's much more comprehensive than that. And I think it starts off in like Boston. And so when you think of the 60s, I think people immediately assume LA or New York. And so looking at other places that had a contribution to the wider culture of the 60s and that decade. Next, like 75% of the shelf is just like music acts and musicians. So if you are here for something else, please ride with me, because at the end I do have other books, not just about that. But a big chunk of it is about the music of the 60s. That is where I have like a greatest interest in, is these musicians and their origins and how they come up with the music and how did their music become so influential. So diving in, I have to shout out Texas's own. We have Janis Joplin, in her biography written by her sister, Laura Joplin, called Love Joplin. Here we go. I have a sticker right here, unfortunately. But it's about her life in the music scene and her electrifying presence and her like iconic voice. And kind of just like how tortured she is and how that led to her untimely death. And I think what I like about it is that it's written by her sister. There's letters from Janis in here. And so it's just a different perspective when it's written by, I think, a family member and a close one at that, talking about her sister. And I feel like there's love there. And I like here, it says it, I can't say it any better. Laura gives an unbiased and full-blooded look at the talented artist who is deeply misunderstood. So an extraordinary book if you're into Janis Joplin. I don't think Eileen Myles is actually a musician. I just have her up here. But I got this book off Depop, so I haven't read it yet, but I am excited because I'm right now in my Hotel Chelsea phase. Last year was in my Chateau Marmont phase. And so I will say I have a lot more Hotel Chelsea books than I do Chateau Marmont. So if you know books about the Chateau Marmont or that talk about the Chateau Marmont, please put them down in the comments and I will add them to my list. I feel like it's equal to have the representation of Hotel Chelsea in New York and the Chateau Marmont in LA. And these have both hotels having such a stake in the 60s and an influence on the 60s. Very different charm and very different influence on the time. So please let me know. But on the back, it talks about, it's an autobiographical book, talks about her time as a Chelsea girl in the 60s, and talks about her survival as a poet in the 70s of New York. And so very classic, like the drugs, the alcohol, the poetry, the art happening in the hotel. So it says it's a funny, cool, intimate account of a writer's education. So this is Chelsea Girl by Eileen Miles. Next, we have Jane Birkin, her namesake being the Birkin bag. Although I have recently dove deep into her history, thinking that she was just like a pretty face and a model. And then to find out like she's so much more than that, which I think is a classic uh, misunderstanding of the 60s, is the women of the 60s are often seen as just just a pretty face. A lot of these women are very beautiful, but they are not seen as true artists the way the men are. And I'll say that for a few, but like a lot of them are kind of classified as the muse of the 60s, or we'll go into the groupies of the 60s here in a moment. But I like that this is written by her, it's her diaries, but her account on how she's more than just a model. She's an actor, she's a singer, she's a songwriter. She drafted up the Birkin bag on an airplane and it became what it is today. So if you are interested in kind of a more cultural look about the models and the actors of the time, the Monkey Diaries is good by Jane Birkin. I love listening to Joni Mitchell on Sundays, and so when I saw this book, I immediately picked it up. This is Reckless Daughter, The Portrait of Joni Mitchell by David Yaffe. What an amazing artist, what an amazing songwriter. I have quite a few of her albums and I love listening to her every week. And so on the back here, there's a quote, a pull quote from Leonard Cohen saying she was like a storm. And I think that's so sweet. They go into some of the inspirations for her songs, and the connection that she had with her listeners. I will say she is a unique artist and that not everybody likes her, and that's okay. She has a very unique sound, and so there is a time and a place, I think, for Joni Mitchell, but I think if you're a 60s fan, she is a must. And talking about Laurel Canyon, of course, you can't miss that. Next, we have a biography by the one and only Stevie Nicks, and this is by Stephen Davis. It's called Gold Dust Woman. And I read this a very long time ago because I have tried to see Stevie Nicks 3 times and finally got to see her on the fourth. And so for someone, just it was a multiple things, but I was like, I am going to see her if it's the last thing I do. And so I finally did. She's so charismatic and gorgeous on stage. Just what I imagined it must have been like to watch her in the 60s. But it goes into her background as a youngster meeting Lindsey Buckingham, and then them living their lives together and then joining Fleetwood Mac and kind of just like the craziness that came from all that. But where, of course, the background in Fleetwood Mac is there, but it talks a lot about her relationships and how being a rock star influenced a lot of her life. This is, of course, a must if you love Fleetwood Mac, if you love Stevie Nicks, and it's a pretty easy read, I will say as well. Next, we have Just Kids. A friend of mine not recommended, she gave this to me. I'm still reading it. I'm about halfway through, but I'm loving it. Just knowing about Patti Smith and her experiences, what that led to her music, what the scene was like in the 60s, and how that kind of led to her being more like burgeoning the punk scene in the 70s. What a fascinating telling of her life and her time in the Chelsea Hotel and the art that she was creating and how she sees herself in the media. I think that's just also like a worthy conversation of like she sees herself as a true artist and the art comes first. I really love that. And so I'm excited to read her other books as well. And yeah, she's just kind of like an icon even now. You're seeing her everywhere. And I think that's just amazing. So this is Cash, an autobiography by Johnny Cash. A great book. I really like his music, but knowing his backstory with his music and how does that inspire his work and a lot of his life, I will say knowing his life being very complicated and that he hasn't always been a hero in his own story. I feel like maybe a little bit of it was glossed over, but then he does, I think, recognize some of the things that like he says, like, this wasn't the best of me, and I can recognize like these were not good things of me at the time. I think another thing, and this is no excuse for these people in the 60s, but the drug influence was prevalent and everywhere. And so that just adds another level to this conversation. Also, just a very complicated man with very interesting and nuanced views. And I think definitely someone I think worth exploring and understanding. Next, I have two Leonard Cohen books, and same thing, like he's not specifically the 60s kind of widespreading, but these are, we have The Flame, poems, notebooks, lyrics, and drawings. And we also have The Everyman's Library Pocket Poets, and I think this is his lyrics, but very, very pretty, very beautiful. He was very much a poet first, musician second. But yeah, this is fun because there's art in it and drawings and just very much looks like his private notebook that they published. I haven't read this one, but I saw the cover. I had to get it because it was just so beautiful. But this is Folk Music by Bob Dylan. It's a biography about 7 of Bob Dylan's songs. I haven't read it, so I can't tell you, but by Grail Marcus. But you can see these are the 7 songs, and kind of doing a deep dive across 7 decades of Bob Dylan, the first singer of the American song. That's a bold claim, but I am interested in reading it. It looks like a pretty easy read, and like there's pictures. So like Blowing in the Wind, 1962. I am excited to read it. It is really beautiful, but I haven't read it yet, so I can't tell you. I can't give you like a review. Now, should I be ashamed? Yes, I do. But you can't talk about the 60s without talking about the Lizard King himself, Jim Morrison. And I have 3 of his books. So I do want to separate. These 2 are his like poetry books. This one's really short. This is called The Lord and New Creatures, Poems by Jim Morrison. If you're looking for short books, this is good because like this only has 1 line on the page. Like you could finish this in an hour if you wanted. But yeah, a really short book. We have The Lost Writings of Jim Morrison, Wilderness Volume 1. I know there's a Wilderness Volume 2. I'm searching for it. But same thing, a lot like the Flame book, where it's like poems and drawings and kind of just random things. I feel like a little bit more sparse than Leonard Cohen's Flame. But yeah, the poems and diaries of a rock and roll legend. And then I have a big old biography, The Life and Death of Jim Morrison, Break On Through by James Riordan and Jerry Prochenicki. I did not finish it, as you can see. It is dense. It is a dense boy. This is a doorstop. So working my way through, but it's not one like I'm grabbing to every time. Another doorstop to add to the doorstop collection, we have Life by Keith Richards. Very thick. As I was like planning these books and seeing if I had everything, I noticed that this one had like a little thing on the back. Like it looks like as if he wrote it. And I can't tell if this is in Sharpie or if like it is printed onto the back cover. Like everybody who has a Life Keith Richards book has this little note on the back with his signature. I cannot tell. It looks like whoever owned the book previously tried to scratch at it to also see if it was real or not. So I'm led to believe it is printed on the back cover. Although, if it is not, let me know, because I would like to know if I have a signed copy of Life by Keith Richards. Yes, I read this a while back. Very thick. So yeah, 2 very thick books to add to your collection. And next we have The Man, the Magic, the Truth, Jimi Hendrix. We can't talk about the 60s without the greatest guitar player of all time. Very phenomenal, very talented, a very complex man. That, like, we could talk about what a leader he was in many regards. We can also talk about, like, there was a couple bad things, and, like, hey, that's on complexity of these very interesting people. But this is a really great book. I've always been fascinated in Jimi Hendrix, and just like the fun little things that you learn about people. He wasn't like classically trained in playing guitar. He just kind of like learned, kind of like, I think Joni Mitchell was the same way, just like picked up a guitar and just started playing, and like, forget about the notes, forget about that. Like, it was just all about what it sounded like. So yeah, this is really great. Kind of talked about some of the people in his life, his poverty-stricken background, the racial segregation, and how he turned into this person that represented so much more than just him. And then obviously, like, his tragic, untimely passing as well. And what does that look like for a legacy? So, a great book, and an interesting person to read and look into. But yeah, absolutely check out Jimi Hendrix. I have here a whole collection of Joan Didion. That said, we are not going to talk about Joan Didion. I just want to recognize her and move on, in that I'm going to talk about Joan Didion later on. But as of right now, I want to acknowledge that Play It As It Lays is a very fascinating perspective of the 60s if you are interested in what it must have been like culturally, with the drugs, relationships, the fame, the desert. I feel like the desert was a big character. Very sad, but definitely worth it. Slouching Towards Bethlehem is another good one. Essential Portrait of America in California in particular, because she is a Californian, don't you forget it, during the 60s, in kind of a debut collection. Yikes. Oh, everything's just falling now. I do have, and the White Album, another 60s specific moment, if you're interested in reading about the 60s culture. I also read West and South, very quick little book about the differences in culture in the 60s between like California and Texas. Uh, it's funny to read that with a lot of the commentary of today. There's still that commentary that was existence in the 60s. So worth the read, very quick, and very much in that lovely Joan Didion style. I have also read The Year of Magical Thinking and Blue Nights, but I listened to Blue Nights, so I don't have that in a physical form. This is actually water damaged, but I kept it anyways. But just books about grief. And if you don't know much about Joan Didion, her husband had a heart attack at the table while her daughter was like in a coma with a severe illness, and she ended up, I think, like within the year, passing on as well. And so Joan Didion does have like a whole collection. I don't want to say whole collection like a lot, but she does have a couple books about grief and different viewpoints on grief and how do you process grief. So I do like Joan Didion in that regard, in that I felt very like seen and spoken to. Other than that, she does have a lot of commentary about the 60s, and that's kind of what she's known for, is this like observant reporter of the pop culture scene and the everyday life of people in the 60s. Now, this isn't necessarily about the 60s, but I loved it so much I included it. This is Rachel Kushner's Flamethrowers. This is a fiction book set in 1975. And it was just so fun. If you like motorcycles, if you like a crazy, like wild chase story, I guess not chase is the word, but it was like very like suspenseful and thrilling and entertaining. I think Rachel Kushner does a great job. I have like another one of her books. I really like reading her. So definitely a fun little book. And don't yell at me because it's set in 1975. Thank you. Next, we have The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. I have not read this. I bought this as more of like a referential book if I needed it in my classes that I'm taking. Because, here's a tip. If you were in school and you were writing essays, professors love it when you reference another book, and it doesn't have to be an academic book. I have referenced Lord of the Rings several times, and it just shows the professor how you are trying to make connections from not only that what you're working on and what you're studying, but to other stories, works of art, other documents, other parts of the world. Um, I think like if you can always try and tie it to something, and here's the thing is like trying to stick with a handful, maybe like one, two, or three, but not too much. So that way you can always bring it back. I like to start the essay with like a quote or a theme or something from a book, especially literature books, because I feel like that adds some like fun to a boring document or like an essay or a research paper. And then coming back to that and telling, like, here's how this all connects. There you go. A little fun fact and a little pro tip when you're writing your papers in college. But same thing. I bought Betty Friedan because I thought I might need to reference this in some of my schoolwork. I never have. I also have not read it. And so I can acknowledge like this was a very groundbreaking book at the time. I know it hasn't aged well, but I still think I'll read it for myself and kind of make my own opinion. That should always be a good like practice of um, not believing everything everybody says on the internet about something, but actually like doing your own work and take your own initiative to read about it and make your own assumptions. Uh, Sometimes I find that like when things are said that it's very like extremified or like very one-sided. When you look into it, the actual source itself, and do your own contemplation and reflection to realize that it's a much more nuanced and complicated subject matter. And that is no excuse to whatever the criticism might be about what is said or the person or the art. But I think it's always good for your own practice to do your own research to add to the larger discussion, because after all, it is just plagiarism to repeat what other people are saying and pawning it off as your own words. That being said, I hope you develop your own opinions and thoughts on different art forms and things that come out, especially on the internet. Another pro tip for your essays: don't plagiarize. Uh, this is not a book about the 60s, but it talks about the cults of the 60s. And some people are just fascinated with the cult part, and that's totally fine. I don't have too many cultish things, although I have read more about cultish things. I just didn't find that I collected them or picked them up for some reason. But this is about the language of cultish, the language of fanaticism by Amanda Montell. I think it is worth reading. I know some people say that like it's very simple writing and maybe not well researched. I do think it does a great job comparing today's like emphasis on marketing and advertisers creating communities to have a cult like mindset to appeal to people to join their groups because it benefits them financially. And so she does a lot of comparison with like the cults of the past and then our modern day cults. And I thought that was very fascinating. I think just a different reflection. If you are someone who's very interested in being media critical and thinking thoughtfully about what media you're consuming and what is being told to you, I think this is still a good book to read about how does the language marketing and advertisers use the same way cults did in the past to appeal to your brain and convince you to join their cults. So I thought it was fun and worth the read, and it's very easy and it's very quick. So, and I think you could probably pick it up anywhere now. It's been out for a little bit. Now I have a couple more books. We're almost done. If you have stuck it out with this far, thank you. And I promise I'll try and speed this up. Of course, we have Valley of the Dolls. I think where Joan Didion talks a lot about uh, the 60s in kind of like an essayist format. Valley of the Dolls is about these characters and these women kind of consumed by their route to becoming famous, or these relationships that they're in, along with like just the availability of drugs and how that affects their lives. Power, money, celebrity, and the deadly seduction of prescription pills. is indispensable and gloriously and scandalously fun as ever. And I also love this from Jacqueline Suzanne. She wrote it on her book. The 60s will be remembered for Andy Warhol, the Beatles, and me. So I just thought that was funny. And I think it's such a beautiful book. And this is the 50th anniversary copy. So it's also a thick boy, but it's worth it. And I think I listened to it. So that's why this copy is so pristine. Another thing about women of the 60s, clearly I have a theme. Clearly I have a theme. Having a bunch of books about the women of the 60s. But I have The Girls by Emma Cline, which is definitely cultish. So if you are here for the cults, here you go. I don't think it's about the Manson family, but it's kind of like Daisy Jones wasn't about Fleetwood Mac, like a nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I think this is kind of the same thing of like, it wasn't about the Manson family, but it kind of is. And about the women, these young women, like these were young girls, being coerced and manipulated into this group. So this was very big a couple years ago, but it's a fun book to check out. Staying on our cultish theme, I read Arcadia by Lauren Groff. And this is set in more like the 70s, as it says so on the back, but I could tell you wouldn't know the difference. And it's about this young boy growing up on a commune, and just like his life experiences, how the commune affected his perspective on life and all these relationships, and not romantic ones, but platonic ones and familial ones in his life, and how that all affected how he saw things. I will say it was kind of slow at first, but it picked up about halfway through, and in the end I'm like weeping. And so it is a slow burn, but if you like cults and you kind of like the commune thing and like that's what you're interested in, this is a good fictional book to check out. Like the most famous 60s fictional book everybody loves right now is Daisy Jones and the Six. But yeah, love the book, love the show, so much fun. Same thing, not about Fleetwood Mac, but kind of. I haven't read this one, but it looks pretty. Songs of Ursa Major, and so I have a feeling it's going to be a little bit kind of like Daisy Jones and the Six. But I am excited to check it out. I just think that's such a lovely cover. And then two more books, and these are kind of just like quick overviews, and then I kind of want to go into the groupies. I have, don't mind the sticker right here, but I have Desolation Angels by Jack Kerouac. This is the one that was published in the 60s, and I decided to highlight this one. I read this a while back for something. Don't remember, but it still gave you like on the road vibes. So if you read On the Road, I feel like this is similar. And then we also have Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which is an acid test within itself to read. So a lot of fun. And I think this is also referenced a lot in a lot of music and a lot of movies of the time. I think he was friends with Ken Casey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So they were buds. Another book, I don't have it here, but another book, if it's not about the 60s and not based in the 60s, but is Aldous Huxley, A Door of Perception, The Doors of Perception. I read that a while back, and that's where the Doors got their name from. And so if you're also interested in that, I kind of like knowing where these 60s celebrities and bands get their names from and digging deeper and just finding that it's this huge like long line of like reference after reference after reference from other things. So that is most of the books in physical copy on my shelf. I do have a couple others on my little list here that I want to cover. This groupies of the 60s equally gave contribution into this time period of music and art. Oftentimes they're overlooked because one, they were very, very young women. And I know that is very weird. We look back and know that like right now, looking back, we're like, that's not okay. we can all say, like, yes, the culture was different then, but we also recognize, like, there was a lot of, like, power dynamic issues, and there was a lot of just, like, SA happening and a lot of things in that nature. I don't want this to get, like, flagged by YouTube, but I'm sure you can interpret, with these very young teenage girls being in these spaces with these older rock stars with a lot of power and a lot of fame and a lot of money. Um, I think what is also overlooked is that these are women who created their own art as well. And I like that that's touched on in Daisy Jones, and that's kind of mentioned in the Jane Birkin book, is that they are seen as muses, but they are also the artist as well. And I think that's a huge conversation around Andy Warhol and uh, the Edie Sedgwick movie, kind of about she being used as a muse, but she was also the artist and creator. And same thing, someone who was very complicated and someone who was not a super great person, redeemable. I don't know. I think that's up for personal conversation. But also, like, addicted to drugs and also just around bad company. Like, it's a huge long thing. But I like that there's more narratives coming out that, yeah, in history has seen these women as muses and only muses, but they are also artists in their own right. And so, first, I want to hit on Pamela DeBars. I'm with the band. Like, I think she's even known as, like, Queen of the Groupies or something, but someone who was actively involved with many rock stars and many bands, and, like, lived in the, I think she lived with Frank Zappa. Like, what an interesting woman with very interesting opinions, and very creative. She also, I think, was in her own band. Like, so something just to be said that, like, what a colorful person she is, and you could see that in her book. And just a conversation about, like, we talk about these groupies as if they're just behind the curtain, and that these women don't have faces, but they do, and they were real, and they also had an influence on the music scene as much as all these other people. Next, I want to hit on Eve Babitz. So I've only read her Fast Company, Slow Days. I've only read that one. I really liked it. What a fun, like, I feel like I was just, like, zipping around LA in a convertible from all these things that she's doing. So it's a very fast-paced book, very short. And I do want to eventually read Black Swan because I hear a lot of people talk highly about it. I haven't read all her books, and I do, like, know that she is another controversial person. Um, those are all the 60s books that I have read, I think, in the most case, that I have in person. I tried to go back through my past reading list and be like, what other 60 books have I read? So this is, like, as comprehensive as I can make it. Obviously, there are a ton of other 60 books out there. If you have good ones, I'm really much more interested now in, like, historical 60s books, 60s movements of the 60s, activism, social activism in the 60s. And so if you have recommendations, I'm so open to them. I want to hear them so I can put them on my list. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me and hanging out and listening to me rant about the 60s. I had a good time. So I'll see you all next time. Bye. You can pick. I've referenced Lord of the Rings many times, and if you can somehow get out of here.